Well, it has been a rather eventful week. Of course, the 101st plowing match stirred up the life of St. Croix County. Not to mention the little village of Ivy, due west of here, on the 10th line, right next to the Newberry Fairgrounds, where events of the match were largely focused. Even the Premier got into the act, as I understand it. You may have seen her picture as she drove a tractor across a field. Our two closest neighboring Presbyterian churches in the adjacent municipality to Innisfil, Living Faith Community Presbyterian and Ivy Presbyterian, along with congregations of other denominations, were significantly involved, including in the leading of what they called an old-time gospel worship service that kicked off the event last Sunday. And the events through the week showcased the talent of young and old alike on the latest agrarian hardware, right back to those old classic machines. I heard tractors were dancing. All a rare highlighting of an aspect of rural agricultural life here in this part of Ontario, which for decades has also happened to have the strongest Presbyterian representation in Canada. And then there was the build-up of an unusual and perhaps even unpredicted tension originating in Scotland, as the whole of the United Kingdom and perhaps the European Union braced for the vote of the people there as to whether it was their majority will to remain in the Union or go it alone as their own nation state. And as you know, they chose the former by a relatively narrow margin. Into the wee hours of Friday morning, GMT, much of the world focused on this relatively small geographic zone with a total population not much larger, or actually smaller, than the Greater Toronto area, about 5.1 million people. Yet this place has a notable intimacy with Presbyterian tradition, as you might know. It is responsible for a large part of the establishment of Presbyterianism here in Canada, by way of the influence of the theology of the likes of John Knox, first in the Atlantic provinces, and then as pioneering populations moved further and further west. And so Presbyterians find it hard not to think of Scotland when it comes to their history, but also Holland in its reformed thread, France and Switzerland from its originally Calvinistic stream, that teacher of Knox, and that's to give you a gross oversimplification and condensing of that period of history, religious history. The tentacles of Presbyterianism, of course, go back even further than that, as one might discover in search of the reason for being not just of this denomination, but of this way of thinking and believing and even behaving in church life and more widely in the culture and society in which the church finds itself. The church has been something of a chameleon in terms of adapting to the currents and needs of the world that it serves within and subsists because of. Many who are worried about the existence of the church in the long run need to revisit history, both recent and more distant, and they will soon realize that spiritual need is an ever-present reality in our world, as it is addressed from a Presbyterian point of view today, and as it is rooted in the story of the original presbyters that we think of as the first disciples of Jesus Christ some nearly 2,000 years ago. In an instructive little booklet entitled Why a Presbyterian Church, written by a once well-known Presbyterian minister named Frank Morley, who served in Alberta for a time, nearly a century or half a century ago, the question of why Presbyterianism was triumphant is asked. In case you didn't know, it was triumphant. Dr. Morley offers a clear answer to this question, That is, that it offers the world a coherent and complete system of thought and faith. That it is intensely scriptural, that it is based in biblical teaching as interpreted by great thinkers like Knox and Calvin, and that other original reformer Luther, who sought not to start a new church, but to change the one he was already part of for the better. A church already influenced by formative Christian thinkers like St. Augustine and the Apostle Paul. In this way, Presbyterians have come to believe in the Catholic Church. That is, the church as it is not divided, but united in one universal church under Christ. They advocated a church under Christ and not under the state, and therefore free of any earthly dictatorship. Thus, the Presbyterian Church, as Dr. Morley emphatically concludes, is vitally important to the world today. This is as true today, I think, as in Dr. Morley's time. United. Indeed, are we not all creatures within one united kingdom of God? We are more alike one another than we would often seem inclined to admit. In fact, is it not part of our sinful natures to suggest how much some are superior or inferior to others, especially if we paint ourselves as of the superior sort? Having heard all that, you might say, well, I know this guy's probably if he were a Scotsman, he probably voted in favor of, well, I'll leave you to answer that for yourselves. Probably like the Queen and Prime Minister and the gentleman who honestly raised the question, I recognize that the problem there isn't so easy, just like a lot of problems in the world. It is not just a matter of grabbing hold of certain truths, which would seem to favor one side or the other, and then ride it like a bucking bronco, coming to appreciate things when the ride is over and the dust settles down. Indeed, like most issues human beings find themselves disagreeing about, it is usually the case that there are persuasive arguments on both sides. And I'm sure you all heard those arguments and felt, oh, gee, I would be sort of pulled apart. So how do we settle the perplexing problem of people disagreeing with people, of people encountering people, really? The scripture lessons that come from our lectionary readings this morning, I think, rather readily relate to this state of life in our day. We have a further installment of the story of Moses and his people's journey towards the promised land, and lo and behold, his people are grumbling. Wow. People haven't changed much, eh? His people are grumbling. Not over insignificant things either. They are so uncomfortable, they claim that they would have rather have died in the desert than to have faced the kind of hunger that they were enduring. And so Moses turns to God, and a gift, manna, bread from heaven, comes down, as we heard in our reading. It arrives in the nick of time with the divine hope that the people will behave from here on in. And then we fast forward to the story of the famous parable of the workers in the vineyard, as shared by Jesus Christ. The landowner is trying to get the work done and hires laborers throughout the day, paying them all at the end of the day the same amount, a denarius. And the ones who work the whole day feel hard done by in view of the fact that some who worked only a small fraction of the day got as much as they did. The world is always grumbling. But the Christian perspective on life, the Christian system of thought, if you like, Christ himself, in fact, in this scriptural passage from Matthew, urges us to look at things differently than does the rest of the world. And often that is challenging. Indeed, the rest of the world is very much present in this story, don't you think? And resonates with the complainant looking for a fair day's wages as he compares what he earns to that of the guy who worked nowhere near as much. And Jesus, through the landowner, asks, having fairly paid everyone, hasn't he the right to be generous as he pleases and treat the first like the last and the last like the first? Everybody's always looking for a deal on everything. And when they think they've not only not found the deal, but they've been shortchanged, they get really upset, don't they? In some ways, we want absolute equality in life, but absolute equality in real life is unachievable. And so the people grumble. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there isn't often an underdog, as you might call them, in all sorts of human circumstances, where one side is sometimes regrettably ill-treated in a world and community and even personal events. Don't we all look for an answer to the question of who is at fault here? Who deserves to come out on top, say in Scotland, or on the border of Russia and the Ukraine, or between Palestine and Israel, or as those jets buzzed around between Alaska and the Soviet Union in the Bering Strait or Bering Sea, or in Afghanistan, or in Nigeria, or Liberia, or Mexico, or here in Canada. In virtually every land of contention in the world. Actually, if the truth be told, there is contention across the whole world, even in the relatively more peaceful places. That isn't to say some places and some peoples are not worse off than others. It is, though, to recognize a basic truth. Human beings are easily given over to destructive disagreement, perhaps more so than happy agreement. It is something of a gift when they can view one another in common terms, to be united in their perspective on the world. That was what Moses was struggling for with his grumbling people. That was what Jesus Christ made manifest when he deliberately and willingly allowed himself to be taken by the Romans and made an example of in the whole world, for the whole world, revealing to us that there was a better way, a different power and life and love to live by. There was and is and ever shall be a different way of looking at things than the rest of the grumbling world does. Relatively speaking, the idea of nationhood is fairly new. As you might remember, in Jesus' time, there was the Roman Empire. Nations were not at the forefront in that time. The notion of nation is more modern, more definitively arising, some might say, from less than 1,000 years ago, referring to where one was born, and also thereby often indicative of one's rank, as determined by who they were descended from. You could argue this culminated in the 20th century when leagues of nations, the United Nations, came together to attend to the world's problems and needs, growing more acute all the time. One could further suggest that with the power of international or global corporate and monetary powers arising in the economic sphere, that nations have thereby come to be increasingly insignificant. When I found myself a couple of years ago wandering through a Costco store in Surrey, BC, and while doing that I realized that it was identical to the store in Barrie. And I sort of had to remind myself where I was. And there are identical stores in Vancouver, in Kansas City, in London, England, in Glasgow, Scotland. They're all made on the same design, and they have many of the same, if not all of the same, products. Back here in this country, When my telephone hasn't worked, I've found myself chatting with people in New Brunswick, Mississauga, Panama, even southern India. I always ask them what the weather's like and what their life is like, because that's a real opportunity. This past week, a company which apparently sells 80% of what people buy in China, a company perhaps curiously called Alibaba, came on the world's economic stage, and it's worth about $1/5 of $1 trillion, more than the net worth of some small countries. It's not surprising that the commercial world increasingly pays little attention to nation states, as these entities have come to mean or be worth less and less, at least economically. Well, you might ask, are we losing something important there? Well, in our desperation not to lose, we have proliferated the number of nation states, going from a handful in Jesus' time to, I think there's nearly 200 now. Often nations formed with the idea of getting more of their fair share in the world, and perhaps preserving something of a social, ethnic, or cultural unique identity in the process. This sometimes has been a frustrating and seemingly fruitless process, sort of like trying to keep the family together when everybody's moving away. The Christian perspective on life encourages turning the dictatorial truth of the economy on its head and to attend to something more important, the people. After all, what is worth more to you, your bank account or those you love? Well, you might grumble, that's unfair. These things aren't mutually exclusive. You are asking us to make an impossible, if not unrealistic, choice. No, not really, because more and more of our society, to put it crudely, are choosing money over people. People would rather be financially secure than friendless. This way of thinking about or in life is doing a great deal to separate us all from one another and not much to bring us together. Unification. Don't get me wrong here, I'm not advocating the establishment of a Christian earthly empire or a new church state. Like the story we heard from the Gospel of Matthew, I'd like to encourage us just to think of things differently. Adopting a Christian perspective on life is challenging, especially if it means that we might tolerate people getting more than we do, especially when we work longer. Of course, in a truly unified world, where those who have more are united with us in spirit and in truth and also in love, then generosity can become the name of the game. What better way to have friends than to be generous? And by this, I don't mean to imply that we buy friends. Rather, in the Christian sense, they become and are one of us. To quote an English so-called nonconformist clergyman named Richard Baxter, in necessary things, unity. In disputed things, liberty. In all things, charity. When it comes to all of the world's major religions, people often blame or grumble that they are at the root of all the problems in the world, the instigators, the fighters of what's going on. Indeed, within religious groups, including Christianity, we don't find total unanimity, total unity on all issues, as you know. There are, of course, also major differences among Jews, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and atheists and agnostics, you name the group. Should our differences, though, be the most important aspect of our lives? Should this be the foundation of our existence? I don't think so. Imagine a world wherein our common humanity is at the core of who we are. That is challenging in a world that is sometimes violently and intolerantly opposed to one another, over issues that would seem unchangeable. To return to my little booklet, Why a Presbyterian Church? I like the way Dr. Morley concludes by emphasizing the future, claiming that Presbyterians have a dynamic, positive faith which can make people see visions and dream dreams. That's probably what the well-meaning people of Scotland are preoccupied with, and most of us as well, to dream dreams and maybe even to realize some of those dreams. I doubt if Christ had anything less in mind.